Now I present to you His Eminence George Cardinal Pell.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Joseph, and for the invitation to come and to speak with you. I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat, but with a little bit of luck, I'll be able to get through. As Father said, the topic is a suffering church in a suffering world. Originally, when the topic was given to me, it was suggested that it be the suffering church in a post-Christian world. And one of the people I sent it to, one of my friends and advisors, said he didn't particularly like that, and I agreed. So I said, I don't do post-Christian. I don't really like the idea. I don't think in our society, in Australia, or in the United States, we're going to be in that situation within any foreseeable future. But and there are many, many good things happening in the church and in the world, but there is an element of suffering. So in 1868, the English poet Matthew Arnold wrote a very beautiful poem, Dover Beach, and he dedicated it to two themes, and the first of which is the decline of faith. So I want to read two sections from that poem. The first is about the decline of faith. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. And then he turns with prophetic insight to the consequences of this departure of faith in society. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. What might a Catholic say about these two themes? The world has changed mightily since 1868. The British and French empires are gone. The United States, your United States, is the only superpower to be joined by a resurgent and aggressive Middle Kingdom, the People's Republic of China, and that's going to change things mightily. The two major forces hostile to Christianity, Nazism and communism, have been defeated. Nazism at enormous cost in the Second World War, and the communism, at least in Europe and the Soviet Union, was defeated peacefully by a combination of people, but especially by Pope John Paul the Great, St. John Paul the Great, and President Reagan and Thatcher and various other people. Since 1868, living standards, health and education, travel, longevity and literacy have improved spectacularly. We've got nuclear bombs and nuclear power. And the centre of the world is now found in the Pacific, which not in the Atlantic. You people in California will probably find that easy to understand, but it represents the changes in the world. Before describing and analysing some aspects of faith, speaking as a Catholic leader, I would like to stake my claim and set out our basic position. And I'm sure you'd all agree. We Catholics are here to stay. In the USA, in my country, on every continent. Popes come and go with different gifts and strengths, but the papacy is still in Rome, the ancient capital of empire, home of the successor of Peter and bishop of that eternal city. The roar that you hear is not the melancholy sound of a once mighty kingdom departing into oblivion. It is the roar of the Lion of Judah, embattled in many parts, humiliated and often reduced in the Western world, but absolutely devoted to its precious tradition, received from Christ and the apostles, and deeply convinced of the life-giving power of this inheritance in even the most poisonous of atmospheres. And there's no doubt about the good evangelicals, the good Protestants, the Bible Protestants will be with us in these mighty battles. So, and I know you all agree with me, we are here to stay and we are here to struggle. We're not going away. I want to make another point quite clearly, and that is that our position will be worsened numerically as well as religiously if we abandon our unseemly Christian claims to the importance of God, the importance of worship, prayer and forgiveness. If we abandon our claims to the redemptive power of the healing power of redemptive suffering, to the stark, life-giving truths of Christian teaching on abortion and euthanasia, on sexuality, on monogamous heterosexual marriage, on heteronormativity, on the importance of children. Those who argue for this often don't appreciate how Christian claims to the importance of serving the poor and standing with the marginalised are also unseemly and can also be abandoned in an attempt to make ourselves more pleasing. Over the years, I've got myself into trouble. I was once denounced to the Inquisition, as it used to be called, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, by some fellow Australians. I was denounced to them because I deny the primacy of conscience. And I stand by that and I repeat it regularly. Only truth has the primacy. Because while the right of each individual's conscience is important, even sacred, on many issues, these consciences differ. There are many people as convinced about that the right of a woman to an abortion is as sacred as our beliefs about the right to life. My second initial point is to spell out, as I spell out some of these basic perspectives on modernity, I think that we've got to acknowledge gratefully a new development in Catholic history, because I think most of the best commentators on faith and modern life are now living in this country. That represents a change. Previously in the English-speaking world, there were very fine writers in England. Belloc and Chesterton, Monsignor Knox, Moore, Green, Tolkien, and these people. Previously too, there were great writers on the continent, but they've gone. Famous theologians at the time of the council, they've all gone except a man who was known as Joseph Ratzinger and is now our much-loved Pope Benedict. So here in the United States, we've got writers like George Weigel, Father Raymond de Souza from Canada, Ross Douthat from the New York Times, Rod Dreher with his Benedict option, and perhaps most perceptively of them all, a woman called Mary Eberstadt, also from the United States. And this short paper is very much indebted to her teaching. I particularly recommend to you her marvelous small book entitled Adam and Eve After the Pill. I urge you to read it. She claims that the invention of the pill has changed our society as much as the communist revolution in Russia in 1917 changed the world. Now that's a very extreme claim, but she argues for it very cogently. And I wanted to recommend to you an address she gave to the Catholic social scientists on September the 18th of this year, and it's called The Cross Amid the Chaos. And I'd like to begin by highlighting an insight which she took over from the English convert novelist Evelyn Waugh, who gave an interview in 1930. He was a convert, as I mentioned, and he said that the alternatives are not Catholicism or Protestantism, we all understand that. But he said in 1930, the alternatives then were Christianity or chaos. So I'd realised that the tension was no longer between Protestants and Catholics. And as I briefly mentioned, indeed, the good, the seer, the Bible Protestants will be our indispensable allies, and we need allies in the Christian survival and revival, just as they are our allies in the pro-life struggle here in the United States. Now, I have long been aware of the struggle between the radical secularists and the Judeo-Christians. I was well aware of their well-financed and organised secular campaigns, often conducted in a sophisticated fashion, not so much arguing logically, but often highlighting hard cases, sentimental cases, those cases which make bad laws. And so they have systematically demolished in the English-speaking world and more widely the Judeo-Christian foundation of the law on areas such as divorce, abortion, heterosexual marriage, and now euthanasia and gender. And I'd like to commend you, the people of the Catholics of the United States, especially the pro-life people, because I suspect quite a number of you are a little bit like the tribe to which I belong, the Irish Australians, and we very much enjoy bad news. We like recounting bad news and saying that things are terrible. Well, you should be very much aware of just what an achievement it is with public opinion, where you have in the United States as now public opinion which is opposed to abortion in many, many circumstances. It's not as good as we would like, but it's a pro-life majority in many cases. And of course, you have the situation in the Supreme Court, where at the moment they're likely to be sending back the cases to the states for the legislatures there to decide what they want to do. effectively nullifying Roe and Wade. What struck me about War's claim about I wasn't sure that chaos was the right word. Is what our opponent's doing is one of the principal consequences chaos? I have a great admiration for Evelyn Waugh. I think he's a man of profound insight. I've used his writings, say on Constantine, the first Christian emperor. I believe very much in his position. I believe very much in working to try to encourage legislatures to do what they can to help the stream of Catholics or Christians or ordinary people follow a Christian way of life, rather than have all the sociological pressures being deeply hostile to religion, as is pretty much the case at the moment. I'd prefer to have people lapsing into Christianity than to have Christians lapsing into irreligion, as they have spectacularly in Australia. We've gone from 12.7% in 1986 who said they had no religion to now 30% of Australians say they have no religion. And this will have consequences. We're all aware of the consequences it has for the churches, the decline in the number coming to Mass, the people who are leaving the church. But what we've also got to reckon is the changes that it will affect in society generally as Christian beliefs change. I mentioned my reluctance to Mary Eberstadt when she called to see me, and then she said, well, I took the term chaos from Evelyn Waugh, and then she, in her article, she's given 6 good reasons, and I want to recount those reasons because I think they're true. She says we're 90 light years away from 1930. The situation has changed, but the word chaos is still appropriate. The first example she gives is family chaos, going back decades, which she says has weakened the family in a way that's never been seen before in history. Not quite sure that's true, but it's largely true. Through low marriage rates, breakups, abortions, and absentee fathers. The second chaos is psychic chaos. And it's well documented, especially in this country, the rise in mental illness, anxiety, depression, disconnection, and loneliness. And she might have mentioned also youth suicide. Australia's a pretty wonderful society. It's not too different from life in California. I was once in Zambia, desperately poor in Africa. 40% of the people were HIV infected. Desperately poor. There's not one case of suicide. And I go home to Australia, and Australia has the 3rd or 4th highest suicide rate, especially for youngsters and young males in the world. It's the tip of an iceberg which exists. It's not an ocean of suffering, a ton of suffering. And an exorcist came up to me who had listened to my talk and said, of course, you've got to realize too the spread of superstition, devil worship, of possession, how that has increased radically. And that makes sense also, because when religion declines, people won't be scientific skeptics. They will lapse into some form of superstition. The third area of chaos she mentions is political chaos. Once again, things I think could be a lot worse, but undoubtedly our society is bitterly divided. Two sides often refusing to talk to one another, imagining the very worst of one another. Even though we feel so deeply about some of these terrible wrongs, we must be able to continue the public conversation to debate and discuss these things. Then she talks about fourthly, the anthropological and intellectual forms of chaos. She says the thinking about gender is often preposterous and magical, where many people today no longer know what every child knows, and that is who they are. So it's quite extraordinary that young people, years before they're entitled to drive a car, years before they're entitled to vote, are able to start changing their sex without the consent or possibly even the knowledge of their parents. And in the state where I was born, in Victoria in Australia, by law, you are prevented from praying with these people, much less from counselling them against that passage. Eberstadt gives another example, the fact that the chief chaplain at Harvard University is now an atheist. And so she said, in this sort of world of psychic and intellectual confusion, we've got terms like pro-abortion Catholic, atheist chaplain, former man. She says these are examples of a signature irrationalism and demand that we cancel Aristotle and believe that A and not A are true at the same time. Now, for a timid and cautious prelate like myself, who committed to hoping that the glass is half full rather than almost empty, these claims are unpalatable. And while I can point to many places where such extremes are not taking place, I cannot deny the logic of the claims where such forces are in play. These forces are illogical, and they are examples of radical chaos. So the question is, what is to be done? An Australian I admired very much was a man called Bob Santamaria, political writer, activist, organiser. He used to quote that. He didn't mention that probably the most popular place where this phrase, what is to be done, where it comes from, it was a pamphlet written by Lenin from Switzerland to describe the situation in pre-revolutionary Russia. I wish to make two suggestions. And the first of those is to impress on you, and I probably don't need to do that, the importance of preserving Catholic identity, doctrinal unity constructed around the apostolic tradition, around the rule of faith. Every one of us, from Pope, Cardinal, Archbishop, layperson, priest, we all stand under the apostolic tradition. And we have to acknowledge that we respect it, we follow it, and we defend it. We are not the masters of the apostolic tradition. We cannot change and improve what Christ has given to us. Now, I accept that there are significant examples of development, the development of doctrine, the way we treated slaves, for example, but these are developments within the tradition. There are no backflips in the tradition. The religious teachings of Christ are not turned on their head. And the second reason for fidelity to the apostolic tradition is that where there are many examples in recent history where the adoption of a radical liberalism in faith and morals and liturgy has provoked the collapse of the church in a generation. And I'm thinking, or two, I'm thinking of Holland and Belgium and Quebec, and in a liberal Protestant group like the Episcopalians here in this country. Regular prayer, reverent celebrations of the traditional liturgy, fidelity to the Ten Commandments, they don't guarantee religious survival and prosperity, but they're essential prerequisites. In other words, a good deal of the Catholic decline is self-inflicted. And we've got to be careful that we don't continue to do that. So you might summarize my first suggestion by repeating what we all know, that traditional Catholicism and the Jewish traditions from which it drank, we're heading in the right direction. The Catholic story, when it is centered squarely and courageously on Christ, demonstrates that the message is marketable and that it improves humanity. The mix works when we work with the Lord. And I had 404 days in jail. I've got no new revelations, but I did emerge with a deeper conviction about the usefulness of redemptive suffering, and a deeper conviction that what Christ teaches is not only true, but it works. And many of you, I've heard it over the years many times from people, they would say, "Father, I don't know how I would have got through this time of difficulty without my faith." And that's what I'm saying. I'm also saying that secular modernity causes many multiple forms of suffering, which we can ameliorate when we understand their true origins. And we've got to remember that Christ was a healer of the blind, the disabled, the sick, and the possessed. And we need to bring this healing to others. Abelstad is quite explicit that this truth has been unsaid for too long. Secularism is an inferior culture. It is small of heart. It defines suffering down, so that those suffering are not acknowledged as victims, but as justified collateral damage. Compare this to the heart of the Lord we see in the Gospels, in his response to the victims of sin and suffering. That's the heart we must have. So one of my messages to you tonight is that the secularists are wreckers, and they are busy at work. Chaos is the end result. Chaos is the main characteristic of the way of life the secularist wreckers are imposing on us, not liberation, not health or peace of mind, or communities united beneath and beyond their differences, but a tribal, fretful void, anxious, divided, and regularly frightened, now by COVID, and also by the spectre of global warming. The forms of misery today are acute and various, and they prey especially on the young and perhaps the Middle Ages. I want to give you one spectacular example of that, taken from some statistics which were obtained in Japan. In Japan, the stats show that something like 43% of women, 22 or 23 or 25% of men between 18 and 24 are no longer interested in sexual physical contact. They've been desensitized by pornography. It's a massive problem, not just for us Christians, but for society as in general. It's something I didn't anticipate. I thought we could perhaps see more, as a result of the spread of pornography, more violent sex crimes, but that hasn't happened. But we do have this paralysis. So that one of the functions of the church in the decades that come will be, as it has been in a couple of periods, in the 4th or 5th century with the Manichees, the time of St. Augustine, the 13th century with the Albigensians, to explain to people the beauty and the usefulness and the goodness of the sexual activity within the holiness of heterosexual marriage. There is a strong correlation between mental distress and the decline of organized religion where social bonds are weakened. Damaged peoples don't thrive. Christianity in particular deepens the sense of community and social belonging. And anxiety and depression are connected with disconnection and loneliness. Drugs such as marijuana are long-term depressants. And drugs damage self-perception, self-understanding. And even for a fevered mind, if we can get across to them the conviction that the one true God is at work in the world, there is such a thing as providence, and that God is good and loving, and that there is an eternity where justice will work out. Such a vision should be a help even to the most fevered minds. So I will leave it there, but conclude with an excerpt from an English writer. He's probably the best apologist, the best explainer of Christianity in the English language in the last 100 years. I don't always like what he's saying. He's much too clever, and he can often be paradoxical. But I'm talking about G.K. Chesterton. I know there are 20 or 30 Chesterton schools around the United States. That's a wonderful development. He was quite a prophetic figure. And I'd like to close with this excerpt from his book on orthodoxy. He writes of the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. He says it's easy to be a heretic, easy to let the age have its head. To have fallen into any one of these open traps of error and exaggeration would indeed have been simple. But, and he continues, to have avoided them all has been one whirling adventure. And in my vision, the heavenly chariot flies thundering through the ages, the dull heresies sprawling and prostrate, the wild truth reeling but erect. And after 80 years of Catholic life, that's my vision also. Thank you.
Is that going to allow entertain questions for 15 minutes? And so let's see how many we can get in that time. Do we have, and I will say also, Elizabeth, you first, but the Cardinal will sign copies of his book, Prison Journal, in the back that Nations Press has provided 40 or 50 copies, and so if you want to get an autographed copy, the vestibule is where the Cardinal will be after this question and answer session. So let's start with Elizabeth.
Thank you, Cardinal Pell. This time in prison, when you've discovered or maybe strengthened your experience in redemptive suffering, were there particular devotions or something that you did to help you accept and maybe even embrace this suffering of yours?
I don't know whether there were particular devotions, but I had my breviary. I don't know whether it was according to the regulations, but from the very first night they allowed me to have it. I was very grateful for that. It was providential that I went in as the time of Lent, and so the readings were from daily excerpts were from the prophet, from Job, the book of Job. The most explicit attempt in the Old Testament to cope with innocent suffering. Job doesn't succeed. He's got no answer because he didn't believe in life after death, or at least he believed in some sort of shadowy existence where everything had been messed up, but he didn't believe in personal immortality after death, and he certainly didn't believe in a good God who would judge, reward the good and punish the evil. In other words, balance out the scales of justice. But nonetheless, it was wonderful to hear Job arguing with God, his friends arguing with him, his wife telling him to curse God and die. The Jews believe that if you suffered, it must be because you had sinned or your ancestors had sinned. And so Job kept saying, I'm innocent. And his friends eventually concluded, no, that couldn't be the case. He must be guilty of some sin. That's the only reason why God would have penalized him in such a way. The book of Job acknowledges that that is the case. But Job's good fortunes are restored in this life. My barrister was an atheist Jew. He knew the book of Job, and he regularly spoke to me about my problems and Job's problem. And I always said to him, I hope I finish up like Job, because Job got the good results. Job's good fortune returned in this life, and so did mine. Hence I'm here tonight, so I'm grateful for that.
Questions?
Your Eminence, thank you very much for being here tonight. My name is Nathaniel. I'm married with Raquel. We have 2 children, one asleep and one not asleep. And we are an itinerant team from the Neo-Catechumenal Way, also with many brothers from this diocese here to hear this testimony of yours. So we're very grateful. You outlined very well the situation of the world in which many of us no longer see it as a theory, but as a day-to-day reality. That many of us, especially with children in schools and through the media, through social media, are seeing that everything you say is true, that this is a reality in the world. And so, I personally have seen that the church has always been there for me, as a help, especially through the charisms that arose since the Second Vatican Council, one of which being the Neo-Catechumenal Way. And I would just like your thoughts on how these charisms, these fruits of the Second Vatican Council, are instrumental for this reality in which we live today, this challenge, the many challenges within our society and also within the church.
Thank you. I'm happy to do that. I'm very much a long-term friend of the Neo-Catechumenal Way. I don't walk with the community in any formal sense. I regularly attend their meetings. I've got many very close friends. I saw it as my business as a bishop to support those life-giving Orthodox movements that were helping people to live as Christ wanted them to live. So I'm very happy to come to this parish because I am sure that it is a life-giving community in a basically true Catholic sense. I certainly support the neo-catechumenal way as another example of that. Their sense of community. What has happened is that our sociological defences are no longer as powerful as they were against the forces of evil. I mean, look at the way internet pornography is entering into our houses and into the hearts of our children, sometimes without even the parents knowing. Even on television, occasionally, perhaps more than occasionally, a deal of the views and persons that we encounter on television, if they fronted up to the front door, we wouldn't let them in. The neo-catechumenal way has one thing that is essential, and that is community. If you want your children to practice the faith, you have got to introduce them to a community of believers, where especially when they are teenagers, they don't have to rely just on their parents or argue just with their parents, but also with other people. And if you can put them with other young believers, that is very, very powerful. One of the great strengths of the neo-catechumenal way is that they are handing on the faith pretty successfully to the young people in their communities. That's a great plus. I attended a meeting in north of the Sea of Galilee, organised by the Neo-Catechumenal Way between bishops from around the world and about 50 rabbis. And some of the rabbis didn't know what on earth they were supposed to be doing there. And the rabbi who organised it said, I wanted you to encounter a movement that was able to successfully hand on the faith to the children. I'm a great supporter of Opus Dei. I think they do many good things. I also, I know they're under a bit of pressure now, support the traditional mass communities because they're smaller, but they too often have strong communities, and often they're able to hand on the faith. As I repeat, as a bishop, I saw it as my obligation to support all these groups, the many different sorts of groups, and especially the basic parish communities, which is the groundwork, the essential groundwork for everything that we do. So I'm happy to say a word in favour of the neo-catechumenal way and the insights from the Second Vatican Council which they embody.
Thank you, Cardinal Pell. So I actually originally heard about you, and mainly actually heard about you from a debate where was a discussion with Richard Dawkins way back, I don't know, over 10 years ago, I believe. And nowadays, to some degree, Richard Dawkins intellectually is just quite boring. Even someone like George Orwell would have been much more interesting, not George Orwell, H.G. Wells, or Bertrand Russell, at least, would have been much more interesting. But I think when you made the point about morality, Dawkins just dismissed it and with his British accent, oh, that's absurd, I can be a good person, and that was that. It was a quite, he didn't really try to find any sort of deeper answer for the questions that religion answers or pretends to answer. And I believe now he's like into Buddhism or something. But to bring back to the point, you talked about secularism brings forth chaos. And, well, I think that's true. Do you see that chaos
Thank you. I agree. Dawkins wasn't a high-class opponent. He knows nothing about philosophy, and he made no attempt to understand that side of things. And not only has he got no answer on morality, but even worse than that, he says it's ridiculous to seek meaning in your life. Well, human beings are not like that. If something disastrous happens in the family, there's a marriage breakup, if a child dies, or a loved one dies suddenly, it's instinctive, universal. People say, what's going on? Why is it like that? So I was pleased to speak against him, and I don't think it did too badly. And just recently on this tour, I met a young fellow whom I was immensely grateful to hear from him. He said, as a result of listening to me, trying to do my best against Dawkins, he became a Catholic. So I thought, well, that's one blessing, one reason for gratitude. Look, the secularists are organised, active, spending immense amounts of money. They see themselves as liberating people. They argue for autonomy, that every person should be able to decide for himself what is right and wrong, to break out of the limitations of family life and heterosexuality and unwanted pregnancies through abortion, and we don't want people suffering at the end of life. No, they are very, very organised, heavily financed, and they put their money, the amount of money that would come into presidential campaigns here from anti-Christian lobbies is quite enormous in some cases. The amount of foreign money that came into Ireland for the referendum, I think it was on divorce, was enormous. No, they're very sophisticated, they do have a program, but the end result is chaos, is suffering. And I think we should be aware of that. Thank you.
You mentioned briefly about the increase of satanic worship in the United States, and definitely I think that's something everyone's seeing in music, internet, media, bumper stickers on cars, every other day. I'm wondering, this is a more social question, how as Christians dealing with satanic culture in the media, or just with schoolmates or colleagues at work, what is a Christian way to respond to that?
Well, I'm no expert in that area. I've never done an exorcism or anything like it. I've been asked once or twice, and I said, no, to be an exorcist, you've got to be wise and holy, and I'm neither of those things, so I would send them off to other people. But it's, I had a bit of a struggle to find a priest who would be prepared to be the exorcist in my diocese, but I very much regarded it as important. I do believe in the reality of satanic possession. I would concede in many, many cases it was simply psychological trouble. And I think before there's ever an exorcism, I would recommend that a person be examined by doctors or psychologists. But there is such a thing. If we feel that we're encountering something that might be a little bit demonic, I always suggest to people just to make a sign of the cross. The devil is a bit of a coward, and the devil does not like the sign of the cross, and with the sign of the cross often the devil will be gone. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions too quickly about the presence or otherwise of Satan. But it's inevitable that if Christianity continues to decline, people will lapse into superstition, and a percentage of those will be taken over by Satan.
Now we'll have two more questions.
Thank you, Your Eminence. You said correctly that Catholics are not going anywhere, and you also described astutely the change in the culture around us. And it means that, at least in my mind, that we are now at an interface between a difficult culture and our faith. And I'm wondering how, in your opinion, we might think of that interface and prepare for what could be sometimes pushback. We live in a cancel culture, quote unquote, and whether the impact is very mild or non-existent or significant, how might we prepare for that and think about it?
Good. A couple of preliminary points. We had a marvellous Irish Archbishop in Melbourne. He died when he was 99. He hadn't retired. He'd been there for between 1917 and 1963, whatever that number that is. Now, he said one of the things we must remember is we now live in a democracy. So we are able to defend ourselves politically and defend ourselves through the ballot box. And we should be prepared to do that. In other words, to be prepared to battle, cooperate with others to preserve religious freedom and to resist encroachments on our religious freedom politically. But we need allies. The second thing is I'm a great supporter of, the Becket Fund, that foundation which defends the church in the courts and legally. That is, I think there are other agencies doing that, but that's vitally important too. But the really, the foundational aspects, I say, one of the important things is every family is imperfect, but to try to keep our family as good and strong as it is, to cope with the imperfections and do the best we can with them, and then to keep our parishes strong, keep this parish strong. There's enormous health and help from the community for all ages in a parish like this. And then, of course, the different church movements, I've mentioned just what a help they can be. But we have the basic answers. Some areas the problems are new. Pornography is a new problem. We need to talk about that. We need to help young people, and it's already wrecking marriages. And it's not just a male problem. It's also among the women. Loads of people who are much closer to day-to-day life would know much more about that, but you need to talk about it and help people to escape from it.
One more question, and the question will be mine. The Cardinal will be in the back in the vestibule. Perhaps you can ask the question back there as well. I want to thank everybody who has visited to our parish. Just to let you know that Star of the Sea, here's the ad, here's the commercial. We're open 24 hours a day with Eucharistic adoration, so you're always welcome. We have the Eucharist on the main altar throughout the day and after the evening Mass in the chapel. So there's a place in San Francisco that is always open for Eucharistic adoration, just for you to know that. My question for the Cardinal is, during your 404 days in prison, perhaps you could tell us the most significant sustainer of your hope was. Your serenity is quite admirable in being accused and then imprisoned. Is there any one thing that you could tell us for us to keep our serenity and our hope in difficult moments?
I think my answer basically comes from my faith. If you believe that God is good, if you believe that God is all-powerful, if you believe that God is active in the world, even though you've got no idea what he might be doing to yourself, these basic convictions are an enormous help. And so people have often asked me about forgiveness. And I said, well, we decide to forgive, and then we hope that our feelings follow. And generally they do. But forgiveness is like faith. You can't say, I believe, then never say a prayer for 10 years and imagine your faith is still going to be strong. If you decide to forgive, you've got to keep it polished. And every now and again, of course, you might feel a surge of resentment so that you feel anything but forgiving. I just conclude with a story I often tell about two English converts. They were Lord and Lady Longford. I think they were Irish nobility, both writers. Their daughter Antonia Fraser is a very well-known historian, period of the Reformation. They were both characters. The Lord was especially eccentric. He wrote a very good little book on humility, and then he wrote 3 volumes of autobiography, which is not a bad effort. But Lady Longford, one of the reporters said to her, "You're a Catholic?" "Yes," she said. "You've been married for many years to your husband?" "Yes," she said. "Have you ever thought of divorce?" And Lady Longford said, "No, never, but I've often thought of murder." Thank you. God bless you all.